All right, this is the lecture on the New Deal. Remember that previously we had talked about causes of the Great Depression. So I'm going to pick up in 1932 after Franklin Roosevelt wins in a landslide victory and brings to the presidency his infectious enthusiasm and kind of his try anything type of program. We're going to get into different parts of that program that's called the New Deal. And it's called the New Deal. He was giving his acceptance speech for the Democratic primary, and a part of his speech, he said, I want to offer Americans a new deal. And so that term just became kind of the emblematic or coined in terms of his program when he took over as president. Now, the New Deal is sort of broken down into three basic categories. Every program that was created can be broken down into either relief, recovery, or reform. So relief is what was done to kind of, stop the bleeding. Just make sure that poor people or people that had lost their jobs were able to at least eat. And so this was like minimum money to give them to make sure that they could pay their electric bill, or they could get food for their family. Roosevelt did not like to do this. He called it the dole, which meant just giving out money. He didn't want people to become dependent upon that. But he did want to ease their suffering until they could find a job. Then they could start, again, taking care of themselves. Next are recovery. Government aid to help the economy get going again. So these were a lot of times public works jobs, building roads, infrastructure for canals, schools, that kind of stuff. So this would, help people to get going again, to give them jobs so they could help themselves. And then the last R is reform. So reform was to make sure that our economy would never plunge so deeply into an economic recession. And we're going to talk about things like the FDIC. The FDIC is basically the government's guarantee that no matter what a bank says it has in terms of money, that the federal government guarantees your deposit. So if the bank says that you have $2,000, even if they loan money out, that there's still $2,000 somewhere backed by the government that's yours. And so that's reform. Just make sure this never happens again. Now, Roosevelt's first 100 days in office is the kind of the biggest flurry of legislation that passes. And, really there's not another time in American history. Well, I guess other than what Biden's doing right now. But even then, it's probably not as great as what we saw in terms of the amount of programs that come out of what Roosevelt's first 100 days in office look like. And so that 100 days, there's a lot of different programs. And one of them was designed to ease panic and ease stress of the banking system. Remember, one of the problems or the cause of the Great Depression was that, people couldn't pay back their loans. People freaked out because their banks weren't getting paid back. And so as you can see in this picture, there's what's called a run on a bank. People are frantically trying to get their money before the bank collapses, which is causing the situation to be worse. And so, by 1932, 1933, people just didn't trust the banks. They just wouldn't put money in the banks. And that was deflating the money supply. It was not allowing for the expansion of industries or really, home construction or anything like that. And so Roosevelt really wanted to restore the confidence of the American people in the banking industry. And so the first thing he does is he declares what's called the bank holiday. And so he just closed all banks. All banks had to close around the country for a little bit less than a week. And so then the biggest ones, which were the ones that America could not afford to lose, the federal government, used the Treasury Department to go through and inspect those banks and to make sure that they were what were called solvent. In other words, that they were sturdy enough, and that if they weren't, then the government would prop them up. And after that kind of 4 days, then the banks reopened. They passed this thing called the Glass-Steagall Act, which guaranteed deposits. So the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, this guaranteed depositors that their money would be there. They also created this thing called the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. And the Securities and Exchange Commission is a watchdog agency. So they watch the stock market. So if you guys remember with GameStop, how people were trying to short the GameStop stock, the SEC was all over that, making sure that what people were doing was not technically illegal. We've had times where the Securities and Exchange Commission will look at groups for insider trading. They will, shut the stock, advise the government to shut the stock market down to make sure there's not a panic. But these kind of things weren't around until the New Deal. Now, one thing crucial to restoring the confidence of the banking system was FDR's use of the radio. He was, I don't want to compare him to Hitler, but both he and Hitler were very effective at using the radio to coalesce opinion on on their programs. And we like to think that FDR did it in a little more positive light, but FDR also had his critics too, and we'll talk about those people. But the fireside chats were a very kind of calming. The idea was he was sitting at the Oval Office. There was a fire crackling in the background, and he was just talking very calmly to the American people. And the American people, liked the sound of his voice, and very soothing, very calming. And he told them, "Hey, it's safer to put your it's safer to put your money in the banks than it is underneath your mattress. Go put your money back in the banks. It's guaranteed by the federal government." And almost immediately this happens. And so just, what we call kind of fiat confidence had been restored to the banking system. And if you look at this graph, this looks at bank failures and farm failures. And you can see that really 1933 is a kind of a banner year in terms of when it's at its worst. And then as we go through the 1930s and early 40s, bank failures are almost a thing of the past. We have very few bank failures after the creation of the FDIC. Okay? Now, the last thing, and this doesn't exactly happen in the first 100 days, but it's talked about. It's kind of toyed around with, and that's the abandonment of the gold standard. Remember that when we have America on the gold standard, there's only so much printed money that can be put into circulation. And what I'm saying is it keeps the value of the dollar up, but then money tends to get hoarded by certain individuals. And of course, those are typically the rich people. And there's not enough money out there in circulation. And remember that one of the causes of the Great Depression is a lack of consumer purchasing power by the middle class. They had been feeling the burden of the country's taxes. And so there was too much money in the hands of the rich, not enough in the hands of the middle class or the lower class people. And so what FDR does eventually is he gets America off the gold standard. And this allows the federal government to manipulate the value of the dollar. And in this case, they actually needed inflation. They needed there to be more money in circulation, and this allowed them to do that. And then the other way that they tend to do this is by messing with what are called interest rates. And so typically speaking, if they want people to borrow more, they lower the interest rates. This kind of causes inflation. If they don't want that, if they want to deflate the currency, then they increase interest rates, and then people are less likely to buy stuff on credit. And then then that kind of contracts the money supply. Okay. We're going to go through a bunch of acronyms, and I know this is going to be really tough to remember, but we kind of call this the alphabet soup of his programs. So I'm going to give you the ones that I feel are the most important, the ones that I think that AP is most likely to ask you about. Probably FDR's favorite of his, in this case, kind of relief, where he is trying to, give people money so that they can pay their bills and things like that, but also doing, some recovery in terms of making sure that they can pay their bills and things like that. Doing some work that's positive, but then being able to be paid for that. And so one of his favorite programs is called the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, the idea of this is that, and this goes for a lot of his programs, they were targeted mostly for men because they believe that, if there's a limited amount of jobs out there, and the ones that should be available should go to men. And so this targeted single males from age 18 to 25. The idea was that they would do makeshift work, parks, schools, roads. You can see they even did like planting of trees and forests. Red Rocks was actually built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. But what they did is they paid these guys $30 a month. And I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but back then it was enough that it was reasonable money. And then that $30, most of it went back to their family. So $25 of the $30 went back to their family, so like their mom and dad, and then they kept $5 of it. Again, it was mostly public works, and it put over 3 million men age 18 to 25 to work. And the nice thing about this was, things got done. So things got built, things got repaired. Good things happen, and yet people had to work to do it. So it kind of worked both ways. Okay. Now, in terms of African Americans, they also had, and there were Native American CCC groups, Japanese American ones, and they were segregated. They oftentimes got paid less than the $30. They did have CCCs for those minority groups, but again, they were segregated from the white groups, and the white groups typically got paid more. All right, now this one's purely relief. So this is FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And literally what this did is this made sure that people could eat. So this was money that would just be handed out. And so you could stand in line, you'd show some sort of qualification from your state, basically unemployment place, and then they would just give you a certain amount of money. They wouldn't give you a whole lot, but just enough. And I think typically states paid out weekly. Some of them paid out monthly, but I think most of them were weekly. And, a lot of times they were just giving people $10, $20, $30, depending on how big their family was, just to make sure that they could eat. And this really stopped the bleeding. All right, public works. So there's kind of two groups that we need to know. Probably one of the most famous groups is the Public Works Administration. And, they built roads, they built bridges, buildings, dams, all sorts of things that would put lots of people to work. And so these are federally funded, basically, internal improvements. You contrast this with other times in America where people, were just never would allow this to happen. And now we have the federal government funding these kind of things. And really it's just it does a positive good, but then it also puts lots of people to work. The first of these programs was called the CWA, the Civil Works Administration, but it only lasted for a few months. And really, it was just there to make sure that they immediately put people back to work. But really, the two things that these programs both have in common, because I doubt you're going to remember the details of both of them, is just public works. Like they tried to, you can see these people on the bottom right, they're probably helping to build a dam or a canal or something like that. And so they all have a shovel and they all have a wheelbarrow, and it just puts a lot of people to work and gives them money instead of just handing it out to them. Now they're doing a positive good, and they feel good about it. All right, help for the farmers. We want to put down the AAA. So the AAA is help for the farmers. Remember, the farmers had really struggled during the 1920s and early 1930s. And so that brings us to the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Okay? And what's kind of interesting about the Agricultural Adjustment Act is that it basically paid farmers a subsidy not to produce as much. So take stuff out of production. You can see that field where they probably could have grown their hay or whatever all the way to the trees, but instead they're growing half of it. Pig farmers, instead of growing 1,000 pigs, now you're going to only grow 500 pigs. And hopefully you can understand why the government's trying to do this. They're trying to create scarcity, like artificial scarcity, and then that would bring up the prices. Okay. The other thing they help do, and we're going to see some, like the Farm Credit Administration is going to do this as well, where they are going to help farmers to refinance their mortgages and things like that, giving them more money or allowing them to pay over a longer period of time. Eventually, though, the AAA, by probably the mid 1930s, it's being challenged in the courts, and it eventually works its way up to the Supreme Court. Remember, the Supreme Court is, at least before 1936 and 37, the Supreme Court's pretty conservative, and they actually strike down the Agricultural Adjustment Act as unconstitutional. And I mean, you can kind of understand why they did it. It is basically communism. It's basically controlling supply and demand. You're just have the government paying you not to produce or telling you what to produce. And so, they struck it down. Now, eventually, FDR gets around this by framing it in the vein of, hey, if we don't plant crops, this is soil conservation. And they were able to get away with it. Now, they came up with the money to pay for this stuff through a processing tax. And so when you would take like wheat to a mill and you had to pay a processing tax for that mill, some of that money would come off, and that would be what would pay the farmers the subsidy to not farm. And so, it kind of boosted their income, so to speak, indirectly with that tax on processing. And it in the short run, it did raise prices a little bit. Okay, now we have help for the factory workers. So if we go back, Agricultural Adjustment Act is help for the farmers. The NIRA is help for the industrial workers. Okay, so the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, what they were designed to do is to help the workers and the management basically get together and to communicate and to figure out what's fair to both sides. And so really, this is where we get this idea of what's called a broker state, where our federal government now becomes basically a mediator between the management of industries and its workers. And so the National Recovery Administration, they created industry boards that would create codes of conduct to regulate business. So we're talking about things like minimum wage, minimum hours, so like a minimum work week, a maximum work week. And then they discussed establishing prices for goods. Again, a little bit like communism, but that's beside the point. They're trying to do this to help everybody out. Now, eventually, just like the AAA, you should write down that the NRA gets challenges in the court. There is a case that is completely within the borders of a state. And they rule in that case that because it's not interstate trade, in other words, trade going between different states, that the NRA has no jurisdiction to tell, in this case, chicken producers what they have to do in regards with their labor. And it's kind of known as the Schechter case or the chicken case or the sick chicken case. But just like the AAA, eventually the NRA is struck down. But I think what's important that you guys need to know about the NRA is that it established a precedent, and that is that through the NRA, workers, especially industrial workers, they start to hold these things pretty sacred. They start to, really push hard for a minimum wage, and they push hard for a maximum work week. And so what we're going to see eventually, as we get the Wagner Act and things like that, this stuff's going to be a reality. This is going to become part of federal law in terms of how workers are treated in the United States, which carries on to today. So even though it was struck down, they lost the battle. Eventually, this is going to help workers to win the war. Okay, next one. Public works and also rural electrification and drought control, flood control help for the rural people. One of the things that the Great Deal did a tremendous amount of was to help the South and the West. You should definitely write that down. A lot of these New Deal programs went to help the South and the West. And I mean, that makes sense in terms of like trying to help the farmers. And so the Tennessee Valley, as you can see there in green, it is a ginormous area. It encompasses several states. There's a lot of major rivers in this area. And a lot of people that lived in this area were farmers, and they were relatively poor. And so the Tennessee Valley Authority had a lot of purposes. Number one, they would want to create dams. And these dams on these major rivers, the Tennessee River, the Cumberland River, and we could go on and on. But these rivers, when they put these big dams on there, they would store up water in reservoirs. And so that way these farmers would have water to grow their crops. Furthermore, these areas every spring were plagued by flooding. And so this would prevent floods in these areas. It provided electricity. Most of these dams, if not all of them, had turbines that created electricity. And so this is a great example of rural electrification. That was a big part of FDR's program. And then the other thing that it did is that it kind of brought back to reality the electricity producers. The electricity producers, in their quest to make money, were charging way too much for electricity. And once the government started producing electricity itself, they're like, yeah, electricity is actually pretty cheap to produce. We should be, this is the real price. And so that's why I have on there the yardstick for price. And really what it did is it put pressure on those companies to bring their prices down so that average, ordinary, and even lower class Americans could afford to pay for electricity. All right. So those building of the dams created jobs, flood control, drought control, all sorts of benefits as a result of the Tennessee Valley Authority. But I think one of the biggest ones is help for these rural areas. All right, popularity of the New Deal. Well, I mean, FDR himself, especially for the first really couple of years, was, you could say, very widely liked. He does have his opponents, he does have his critics, but, really in 1936, he wins a landslide re-election. A lot of people, especially the lower class, especially the middle class, they tended to really like FDR. Even minority groups, Native Americans, we're going to see, African Americans are going to kind of shift their political allegiances, because more than anything, he did a lot to try to put people to work, and especially those people that needed it the most. FDR was a great communicator. He used those, like I said, those fireside chats, those talks in the Oval Office where, he's using his soothing voice, using the power of the radio to communicate to Americans, to really tell them, hey, this is what we're doing. We want you to know. We want to be transparent. We're not holding any secrets back from you. We've got the Civilian Conservation Corps doing this over here, and we've got the Tennessee Valley Authority making dams and providing electricity to people. This is what we're doing. And people are like, all right, great. He's doing a lot here. This is what we want. All right. So even though that FDR by 1936 was very popular and won re-election very comfortably, he did have critics on both the right and the left. So he had people that thought he was doing too much in the right, and then he had people on the left that thought he wasn't doing enough. And he was kind of being tugged by both sides of that. And he had to kind of appeal to people in those bases to make sure he sort of stole the thunder from the people that were criticizing him. All right, so people on the right, they believe that the federal government was changing and altering in a way that they did not want. This is the old Jeffersonian, Jacksonian, Madisonian ideal of the federal government really should be a non-entity and the power should be in the states. A lot of people did not like the communistic-like, in their opinions, control over the economy. Things such as the NRA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, those things that eventually get struck down. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, remember, set price controls, set production controls, and that is really very, at least, socialistic. Okay, they were against what's called deficit spending, and so what we're going to see is that to fund these programs, the American government had to borrow, and they would borrow from wealthy people, from anybody that would basically loan the American government money, and they also printed more money. And so we created, pretty good inflation during this time as well. All right, so opponents. One of the groups I want you to put down is obviously most Republicans. Okay, so most Republicans were against this. There are some progressive Republicans or liberal Republicans, but most Republicans are against this kind of way to run the federal government. And obviously most of them are the major business leaders. And so they kind of joined together in this group called the American Liberty League. And they were never significant opposition, but they were opposition nonetheless. Okay, Democrats. We do have a number of Democrats, especially in the South, that are going to actually kind of be pushed towards the Republican side. And remember, we saw this when we talked about, Hoover in the 1928 election, where we had these Hoovercrats that were against Alfred Smith. Originally, now you have these Democrats that are actually, for the first time, these leaders in the South that are starting to be pushed to the Republican side. And, these would be like, textile owners, the cigarette factories and things like that, where they don't like the government, telling them what to do in terms of labor and things like that. So we do have a kind of a shifting alliance of certain Democrats that will become Republicans or Republican-like. All right, now to his critics on the left. Okay. There were three main people that were more liberal, that thought that FDR was not doing enough. Probably of the three, the most dangerous to FDR would have been Huey Long. So I'm going to talk about him last. Okay, the other two guys, let me just kind of talk about them. So Dr. Townsend, you can see, like, his big idea was we need to help the elderly. And so really the idea that he comes with out of California is this idea for old age pension. Now, hopefully you guys know this today as Social Security, but this is something that FDR is going to say, okay, this guy is becoming very popular. He could be a threat to me politically. And so what we're going to see from all three of these people is that FDR will sort of, in some way, shape, or form, adopt parts of their plan or all of their plan to steal their thunder from them. And this is certainly what he does to Dr. Townsend, which, hey, look, as long as old people get their pension, that's probably a good thing. But that's what we're going to see with pensions. Okay, now over to the right, Father Coughlin. So Father Coughlin was I guess you would call him kind of like today, some sort of shock jock for radio, where he was a sensationalist. So kind of like, a Catholic Howard Stern, in the sense that, he would use very poignant language. He would raise his voice to make a point. But really, the biggest thing we need to understand is that he was an inflationist. He thought that the government should almost take a socialistic or communistic sense of the economy, that we should print more money, that we should give out more loans, less interest rate, and then we should totally get off the gold standard and start coining silver again. All right, the last guy, Huey Long. So Huey Long was governor of Louisiana. He was very popular in Louisiana, and he probably would have kept getting elected governor if they would have allowed him to serve more than 2 terms. After that, he gets elected to the U.S. Senate, and it is very clear by 1936 that he will be running against FDR in the Democratic primaries. His ideas are very socialistic in terms of, we're going to really soak the rich. So we're going to tax the wealthy. We're going to say every man's a king. We're going to share our wealth. The rich people are going to be taxed by far the heaviest. We're going to give that money to people in the form of healthcare and education. We're going to build schools. We're going to build roads. We're going to build bridges with that money, and we're going to just redistribute the wealth more evenly. But he was also kind of a shady character in that he didn't always follow constitutional law. And so, like in Louisiana, a lot of times, he bypassed state constitutional provisions and just got things done, which, for struggling people was good. But in terms of ignoring the laws of the land, he could be a little bit scary that way. And people were worried that if he were to become president, that he might want to become a dictator. And eventually, though, he is assassinated, and he never is able to run against FDR. But what we're going to see from all three of these is that FDR is going to kind of adopt, to some way, shape, or form, the ideas of these people, and it will either steal their thunder or it will help to make FDR more popular with the left. Okay, so that's where we will end with this first New Deal, and we'll start next New Deal with the second New Deal.